Good morning, everyone. My name is Greg McLogan. I'm the founder of Banish Hillsdale. It's a group on Facebook I started back in August of 2011. I'm a 1984 graduate of Hillsdale High School and a 1988 graduate of Hillsdale College. And I want to give thanks to Lori Lothamer, who's here. She's one of our administrators. And Michael Staworski. He couldn't be here today. And we thank them for all their help. I couldn't do it by myself. And really, it's not about me. It's about the 10,000 members we have now contributing and appreciating the history of our county and our city of Hillsdale. And so I'm going to introduce JoAnne Miller, who's going to give a presentation. JoAnne is a member of the board of the Hillsdale County Historical Society, editor of the newsletter, and has written many of the over 350 articles which can be found on their website, hillsdalehistoricalsociety.org. In 2011, for the sesquicentennial of the commencement of the Civil War, JoAnne and Carol Lackey wrote about the first Ghost Walk booklet, which featured Hillsdale County people buried in Oak Grove Cemetery who were involved in the Civil War. That was followed by 4 more Ghost Walk booklets with different themes. Then JoAnne and Carol said, "That's it, no more." And they stuck to that decision until the sesquicentennial of Hillsdale becoming a city. Such a milestone could not be ignored. So JoAnne wrote Ghost Walk 6, celebrating Hillsdale's sesquicentennial. Today she will share with you some of the highlights of the establishment and growth of Hillsdale. JoAnne?
We'll hope this teacher voice lasts. When the first mayor of the newly incorporated city of Hillsdale was inaugurated on April 5th of 1869, he said, "Perhaps some inhabitant of Hillsdale in the distant future, inspired by the spirit of antiquarian research, shall turn his eye back through the dim and misty past to that little village in the deep woods of southern Michigan upon the headwaters of the St. Joseph." And here we are, 150 years later, doing just that. It is absolutely impossible to understate the importance of the Erie Canal. It has nothing to do with Michigan, except everything to do with Michigan. When the colonists first came to the east coast of this country, they were stopped by the Appalachian Mountains. Eventually, Daniel Boone found a gap through the Appalachians that led to Tennessee and Kentucky, and that was called the Cumberland Gap, and it's near Stone Mountain in Georgia. But then, in Ohio, there is what they call the Great Black Swamp. Ohio apparently has marvelous farmland, but it was a swamp at that time, and no wagons could get through it. It was 25 miles by 100 miles, and it covered 15. No, that's right. Those were the dimensions. I'm not going to tell you how much it covered. But it made it impossible for wagons to come through the Cumberland Gap and to go through Tennessee and Kentucky and Ohio and get to Michigan. And so it was with the Erie Canal that people finally were able to get into Michigan territory. Originally, in the 1860s, I think it was 1768, there was a plan for a canal, but the technology was not yet there, so it died a death. However, in the early teens of the 1800s, DeWitt Clinton, who happened to be the governor of New York State, had an idea that it was time for a canal. Now, this was derided. For everybody who comes up with a good idea, there's somebody saying it just won't work. And it was called Clinton's Folly, and it was called Clinton's Big Ditch. But he showed them. It went, in the end, from the Hudson River up, and I have to get the right number, 568 feet to Lake Erie. And it went through 83 locks, each one lifting the canal boats up only 12 feet. And most amazingly, it had 18 viaducts These are roads or rivers in the air from peak to peak. This canal was 40 feet wide with a towpath of 10 feet on each side. It was a two-way traffic. Mules pulled these boats. They were flat-bottom boats, and it was only 4 feet deep. According to what I found on Wikipedia, that could handle 30 tons. So they could load these things up with the wagons and all the stuff that people wanted to take to the frontier when they wanted to make their homes there. At the completion of this massive effort, the Erie Canal masons, many of whom came from England, were out of a job. And so they started to build stone homes, sometimes just with blocks of stone, sometimes cobblestones. This was an art form that lasted a very short time because it's very labor intensive. This home, for instance, took 3 years to get the right colors, the right size stones. There's one in Ann Arbor that not only has the right size stones, but colors. It is absolutely gorgeous, but of course that's not the strength of it. They had a lot of rocks and stones that didn't fit on the facade, so that it's a 21 inch wall behind that actually holds the house up. There are about 40 of these left in Michigan, only southern Michigan. And we have 3 of them in Hillsdale County. There's this one, which of course is the most beautiful, and then 2 more going down State Road. You'll see them on the right as you're leaving town. Another remarkable thing about when the white people came here, the federal government was very interested to get white settlers, and they completely ignored the fact that there already were people living in this area. But when the white settlers came, the Huron Potawatomis, at that time led by Chief Bobbice, were very welcoming, and they lived in tremendous harmony. When the Huron Potawatomis were finally driven out by U.S. cavalry, they had to go to just out of the county in 1840. It was with great sadness on the part of their white friends. The first white settler in Hillsdale, and we're going to pretty much stay Hillsdale now because we're talking about the sesquicentennial. The first white settler in Hillsdale was Jeremiah Arnold, and he came from De Poyster, New York. A lot of our people came from New York for obvious reasons. And he had a land grant in 1834. You probably have seen out at the fairgrounds on the infield, the south end of the infield, a big stone about that high, and it has a metal plate on it talking about Jeremiah Arnold. Well, Jeremiah brought his family in 1834, built a home, and then he was approached by 3 guys. The first 3 were Hiram Greenman, Salem T. King, and Alonzo G. Budlong. You're going to hear a lot of city streets as we talk about these people who first settled here. So these were very young men. They were men in their 20s, and they wanted to buy his land. They wanted to plat the land. So Greenman was given the job of establishing the plat, filing it correctly, and he blew it. And the other 2 were very upset with him. Consequently, he sold his part of the land. Land was very cheap, and you made the money by establishing a city or a town, and then selling off little sections of it, and that's how you could make a lot of money if you had your town in the right place. So he sold his part of the area to Rockwell Manning and George C. Gibbs, and then Gibbs sold his portion to Chauncey W. Ferris and John Potter Cook. 2 other guys, Charles Gregory, and there used to be a Gregory Street where Hillsdale Street goes up from Carlton Road to the college. That used to be called Gregory, and now it's called Hillsdale Street. And then the other fellow was William E. Boardman. Now, I wanted to stop for a second and take us back to that time. I would not do well if I couldn't have a bath every day. I would not do well if I had to spend my entire day in the kitchen doing the cooking and the cleaning up after that, and the laundry, and then the ironing. And then on top of that, at night, I would have other things that I'd still have to do. I don't want that kind of life. So when I think about what life was like back then, I am truly amazed. The guys who came here, in many cases, did not have any education to speak of. They did not have family wealth. They did not have any position. But it was the American dream. It truly was the American dream that somebody with nothing can go into the wilderness and become an important, powerful man. And the first people who came were men. You did not have families right away, even with the Erie Canal, which first took people in 1821. The men had to come first and establish things. This group of men now, young men, who many of whom had been working since they were early teenagers. They would be wealthy in experience and not wealthy in money, but they would have wealth in their feelings of I can do it, and in their ability to recognize that life would have bumps, but if they stuck with it, they would be just fine. And so this group of young men said, you know, the railroad seems to be coming along further north. Let's not plat our town down here, which was by the fairgrounds, dense wilderness. Let's move north. And so when they platted the town of Hillsdale, it was bordered by north, south, part of west, and then down not as far, probably where where Ferris Street is, not as far as where Carlton Road is. It was not very big. And they did plat that in 1839. Already a little plat had been established called the Flatiron Plat in 1837. I've got to assume that was where the wedge is. And then the McCollum Plat in 1842 and the Waldron Plat were established also. And we know that the Waldron block is where the wedge is, and it burned down 2-3 times. So nothing original is left there. In 2015, the Ladies Beautification League contracted with Wes Hardin to do the mural on the Manning Street side of the Board of Realtors building. Do you know what I'm talking about? And there are 4 guys there, and intended to be like the town fathers. And they are exactly the 4 guys that I would choose to be the town fathers. The 2 of them were Cook and Ferris, John Cook and Chauncey Ferris. And these guys were really something. They were 22 when they came to Hillsdale. But before that, they had a general store in Tecumseh, and somebody who would be willing to haul a bunch of goods that people would need on the frontier to the frontier would make a good living. Then they moved to Jonesville, and then finally they moved to where the mill is. And you may know that Cook Street is the one that goes from Broad Street down to the mill, and then Ferris Street meets it at a 90 degrees. And that's where the mill was. They had their general store and they started a mill also. So they were quite young when they came. They established themselves, and then they realized it was time to go get a wife. Now today we put great emphasis on attraction, and do we have similar interests, and do we love each other? You know, love is just such a big thing. Now it wasn't then. It was a business proposition. Women had very little they could do except be wives. And men needed wives so that their legacy could be carried on. They wanted to have a family. They wanted to have children. And that was the reason for working. So Cook and Ferris, deciding it's time for a wife, go back to Cato, New York, where they came from. And John married Betsy Walford. You need to remember that last name, Walford. And Chauncey married Julia Marie Smith. And they brought these two unsuspecting young girls to Hillsdale, where eventually both of them died. I mean, is this any surprise? They were constantly pregnant and or nursing. They were working very hard. So the first one to die was Julia. Did that stop Chauncey? No, he went right back to New York. Married Betsy's sister, whose name was Catherine Walford. So their brave parents sent these girls, the second girl off. Shortly after that, whoops, I will just leave that. Betsy and Catherine both died in 1850. And they, collective 5 children, were taken back by their dads to New York to live with their grandparents for 2 years. John and Chauncey came back here. I don't know what they were doing, but 2 years later, they went back and John married the third Walford sister. Can you imagine being their parents, sending this third girl off after they'd lost 2 of them? And then eventually Chauncey married Phoebe Elizabeth Hedges. And they lived in the house that's right behind the Elks house, the Elks Lodge right now. That was Henry Waldron's house. So eventually, with these 5 wives, Cook and Ferris had 24 children. Not all of them surviving, but these ladies, birth control was not a consideration at all, and they wouldn't have wanted it anyway. They wanted a lot of kids to take care of when they got older. Another one of the guys on that mural is Charles T. Mitchell, and of course we know the Mitchell Research Center, and I would bet that anybody who grew up here went to the Mitchell Library with their parents. I mean, do you remember Coleman? Lots of hours spent there at the Mitchell Public Library. Charles did not have much of an education, but he had a can-do spirit. He wasn't afraid of hard work, and he came as a worker on the railroad. The railroad, by luck, not only had Hillsdale been able to get the county courthouse, or the county seat in Hillsdale, and I'll tell you a little story about that. Jonesville justifiably thought they should be the county seat. They were the first platted town, and they should have had it. But then the people in Hillsdale, who had purposely put their city in the middle of the county, or as close, said, no, we're closer to the middle, we should be the county seat. Now you want it because you got a lot of business if you're the county seat. So they said, let's put it up for a vote. Jonesville did this really clever move that came back to bite them. They established the town of Osseo. Now the only problem is, there was no house, there was no barn, there was no business, there wasn't even an outhouse in Osseo. However, because Osseo was on the ballot, the vote was split between Osseo and Hillsdale, and Jonesville became the county seat. Well, the state found out, not happy, and Hillsdale became the county seat. So now they're the county seat. It is a tremendous advantage. And then, by gum, the greatest luck. The railroad, which had been slated to come somewhere, from east to west to easily get people across the state, by then the state, came to Hillsdale. And not only that, when there was this terrible recession in the country and the money ran out for the railroad, it stopped. So we had the terminus of the railroad, and so lots of people got out here. There were warehouses built along the railroad line for people to store their stuff until a wagon train could be gone. Hotels sprung up for people to stay in until a wagon train could go. So it was a great deal. So Mitchell came originally to work on the railroad. I mean, pounding nails and making a railroad. And he ended up teaming with Cook, Ferris, and Henry Waldron in different combinations, and other people too, with many business ventures, with a bank, warehouse, of course, for the stuff along the track. And then in Cadillac, he had extensive land that he bought very cheaply and used as lumbering land. So he ended up being a very wealthy fellow. His original house is that yellow house across from Davis School, and they moved that from where the Mitchell Research Center is now. And then he built that because, of course, people need to know how important he was. Henry Waldron, he was different than the other three. He did have an education, and he came as a surveyor on the for the railroad. But he had a dedicated work ethic just like the others, and he was not afraid to try things that might be risky. I'm sure that he didn't always succeed. I don't know specifically what he's done, but he did eventually become very wealthy himself. He was in local, state, and national politics. By 1862, he had served 3 terms in the House of Representatives nationally. And President Lincoln, who, along with President Jefferson Davis, thought this was going to be a real short war, this war of Southern Rebellion, realized it wasn't going to be. Part of the reason was that General McClellan, whose men worshipped him, was a scaredy cat. He was afraid to go into battle unless he had overwhelming odds, and he refused orders sometimes to go into battle. So instead of decisively having defeats of the Southern troops initially, which may or may not have happened if he had not been a scaredy cat, the war was going to be a long-term affair. So in 1862, President Lincoln asked Henry Waldron to gather together a regiment, 1,000 men. He went in Hillsdale, Lenawee, and Monroe counties. 2 months he got them. And they encamped over on Lewis Emery's land. Emery had these wonderful clear springs that would be good for bathing and cooking. And they actually encamped on the ridge. Do you know Emery Park at all? There's a really nice walking path that goes along like a waterway, and then up the hill is Wildwood Drive, I think. So that's where they would have been encamped. And then off they went in a couple of months to be soldiers. The railroad was a wonderful, wonderful thing, but it was also like the 1990s .com phenomenon. Do you remember when all kinds of people were going to make lots of money by having a .com company? You know, computers had come in, and a lot of people lost their shirts. A few people did well, but the railroad business was kind of like the same thing. There were a lot of people who bought railroads. One of them, 4 of them, were Waldron, Charles Mitchell, Elijah Litchfield, and Chauncey Ferris. They were able to buy the railroad that had been bankrupt for about 42 cents on the dollar. And they did pretty well. They bought mainly they bought most of the stock. So they did very well there. Now, as time went by, the railroad market was being flooded. They had lots and lots of railroads, and they would lease their tracks to other people so that you didn't have to have it isn't like, it's like carrying a track phone instead of carrying Sprint or Verizon or one of the others. If you have a track phone, you pick up wherever because they're paying some kind of a fee to these different carriers. And that was just like where the tracks were. You could pay a lease to use the tracks. The Detroit, Hillsdale, and Indiana was purchased, however, by somebody else, I don't know who, in 1868. And by 1872, there was a horrendous recession. Are we seeing kind of a pattern here, maybe? So this horrendous recession meant that people were losing their shirts on the railroads. And now this is another one. This is like Jonesville and Osseo. You have to get a kick out of it. You have to admire it a little bit, but it's really not honest. So all of a sudden, in 1880, after the DH&I had been losing money left and right, their balance sheet was just, I mean, it was like at the center of the earth. All of a sudden in 1880, there were all of these trains with lots of boxcars going over the DH&I tracks. And people were saying, wow, you know, they're doing really well. It turned out that what J.W. Smith, who was the general manager of the DH&I, as well as the general manager of the Toledo and Ann Arbor Railroad, had dispatched Erie Railroad. He was also involved with that. He had dispatched Erie Railroad trains to just travel the tracks empty. And they, you know, he was found out, obviously. Crime doesn't pay. I love the history of Hillsdale County. It's repeated over and over again across the country in little places. I will never forget one of the high school kids who had come to visit with a tour of high school kids. And we were inside, and he really was into history too. But he said, when it was all over, he pulled me aside and he said, just before I go, I want you to know that I never realized that the quiet little county of Hillsdale has such a loud history. And we do. We have important history. We are the stuff of what our country has been made. And happy birthday to Hillsdale. Thank you. My goodness, we had my head's getting bigger, guys. I may not get in the door. Thank you very much, and if you'd like to ask me any questions, you may, or if you want, yes. I'm sorry. Yeah, I think it was she asked, was Hillsdale the original name? It was an inspired choice. It is the hills and dales. And yes, it's a beautiful place. And compared to cold water, when my husband and I were going to move to the country with our 3- and 4-year-olds, my husband had job offers in Branch, Hillsdale, and Lenawee counties. Hillsdale, I mean, all we had to look, it was spring, there were no leaves on the trees, but all we had to do was look around at the water. I mean, it is a beautiful county, just beautiful. Anything else? Thank you again.